Hi, my name is Melissa McCradden. I'm a clinical ethicist and associate scientist at the Hospital for Sick Children. And today I'm presenting our organizational framework for addressing bias and fairness issues in machine learning for healthcare. So I assume we all know about algorithmic bias. Just to be clear, I'm referring here to the notion that any group of patients, by virtue of their identity, may be directly or indirectly unfairly disadvantaged by the use of a machine learning tool. Here I follow Abiba Barani's characterization of these instances as algorithmic injustices. And we take it that these pose an ethical threat to the fair use of healthcare machine learning tools. So the JustEFAB Guideline was developed to help identify, analyze, and address algorithmic bias. We draw from our predecessors like the Algorithmic Bias Playbook, the NIST standards, but our framework goes beyond technical performance and considers the life cycle of machine learning with a strong focus on interdisciplinary collaboration and consultation. We prioritize medical ethics principles and social justice as commitments across the machine learning life cycle, and this guideline is generalizable across contexts by taking an eye to be inclusive to non-Western ethical frameworks, which is a noted limitation of prior works. So JustEFAB is guided by standpoint epistemology, which is a feminist theory that advocates that the quality of science improves with multiple standpoints. These standpoints reflect different ways of knowing. So they might be disciplinary or might be through lived experience, for example, verbal passing of knowledge through elders, through communities. And it considers knowledge as a social product. So the knowledge about what is the right thing to do to address bias in machine learning is something that is fundamentally a collaborative endeavor. And so the decision about what we should do to promote justice in the context of a machine learning tool is far more than a matter of actuarial performance and requires such an epistemology for ethical defensibility. So JustEFAB was developed initially as an organizational policy, but we tested for external generalizability across additional countries. It was mapped onto the clinical integration policy at Sick Kids, which comprises 4 pseudo-distinct steps. So first being the exploratory model development stage, followed by a silent trial evaluation of a mature algorithm in its intended environment, followed by prospective testing, whereby we test the relationship between the use of the model as an intervention and a given patient outcome, and followed by a post-integration monitoring protocol. This approach was developed through years of ethics consultations and refined with support from colleagues and feedback from users based on individual use cases. And then finally, it was trialed for feedback and modifications based on consultation with equity-deserving groups at Sick Kids, of which there are many. And so we were grateful for all of the feedback we have received and will continue to receive as this is a living document. So the first stage, following closely with Algorithmic Bias Playbook, looks to preparation and conceptualization through a literature review and consultation. So a priori, identifying the groups who are most likely to be at risk from use of machine learning tools, allowing that to help us identify who needs to be consulted for their help with problem formulation per Ziad Obermeyer's work. The next step is to look at dataset inclusivity. So based on the groups that we've identified as being at risk, what kinds of labels do we have to represent them? With respect to things like race and ethnicity, is this something that a patient defined for themselves, or is this something that a clinician defined? Similarly with gender, are we talking about the gender that is stated on their health card, or their gender identity, or their physiologic sex, or perhaps their anatomy? So knowing what is actually in the data set is really important and how it's annotated. And so we can use tools like health sheets for data sets to enable data reflexivity. This then helps us to construct an analytic plan whereby we would systematically compare the performance between different groups while controlling for covariates like differences in the distribution between subgroups. We move into the algorithmic validation stage where we would explore the fairness distribution of the candidate models. So testing and comparing performance among subgroups along the means that we've identified above. This also means we can use algorithmic fairness methods both as a means to illuminate bias and as potential strategies, design strategies for integration. It's important to note here that JustEFAB doesn't take a position on the reasonability of any particular algorithmic fairness methods. Rather, we consider it something that is requiring empirical demonstration in the silent trial stage as to whether or not these fairness methods could beneficially influence care. We also advocate at this point for testing for post-hoc grouping or hidden stratification effects, whereby there might be clinically significant subgroups of patients for whom the performance drop-off might pose unique risks. So based on this information, we have an empirical foundation for our ethical decision-making. So this is where, based on this information, we would identify which potential biases or differences in performance are clinically and ethically significant, where they would cause distinct consequences to a particular group by virtue of that group's identity in ways that we would consider unfair. So at this point, we would engage in a process called reflective equilibrium, whereby we would balance the benefits and risks of different model strategies, different design choices, in relation to different values that we might prioritize regarding integration. So we've identified three. One might be predictive accuracy. So it might be that the most important thing that a clinician needs at the bedside is the most accurate information, even when that information itself might be biased. Another possibility is formal justice, whereby we might influence the functioning of the algorithm or the outputs of the algorithm to ensure that all patients are treated similarly based on similar features. And finally, a third option is distributive justice, where we would look to specifically advance the needs of the least well-off when in promoting equity. So once we have our initial plan, we would conduct a silent trial whereby we integrate the model into its intended context, but without those predictions reaching the clinical team. Rather, they are recorded by the research team and annotated against the on-the-ground evidence as it comes in. And so this is where we establish the real clinical accuracy of the model, the feasibility, and we can hypothesize about its potential impact on patient care. We can also more robustly characterize the performance across these subgroups prospectively. This is also a great opportunity for an algorithmic audit. And it's also important to know that if some of the empirical facts change at this point, our plan might be open to revision. So if it's the case that we chose to employ a particular algorithmic fairness method, but it's apparent from the on-the-ground comparison of performance that that might actually not work to influence health outcomes in a beneficial direction, we might revise our initial plan. We also look to human factors at this stage, so thinking about how predictions would be visualized by the healthcare team with an eye to universal design, inclusivity and accessibility for clinician users who might have disabilities or particular learning needs. We also want to think about things like stigmatizing language, how outputs are presented to end users, and the language that we use to describe them can be alienating or stigmatizing to marginalized people. Once we have a model that we think might beneficially influence care, we move on to prospective clinical evaluation, whereby we test the relationship between the use of that model and an intended patient outcome. So here we want to take an eye to inclusive research designed to enable diverse participation because of people's right to participate in science. We want to think carefully about the justifiability of different consent paradigms, so whether we're using waived consent or informed consent. We also have to think about the comparison to the status quo. So if the current status quo includes bias and prejudicial care, then comparing the algorithm to that will not be helpful. So we need to think about it in relation to what health outcomes we're looking to change. And all of this needs to be integrated into a patient safety and accountability paradigm that allows us to detect for important things like data set drift. So finally, JustEFAB advocates for informed choices with respect to model design and validation, empirical demonstration of model performance coupled with on-the-ground evidence that the model can influence outcomes in the expected manner. How outcomes should be influenced is subject to collaborative decision-making guided by the views of those most marginalized, and ongoing performance must be monitored for patient safety. It's always important for me to stress that health equity cannot simply be achieved with machine learning, but machine learning can nudge our healthcare systems toward equity. This is the amazing group of people who have helped work on this guideline, as well as the groups who have provided feedback and ongoing consultation for support with respect to equity deserving groups. And with that, thank you very much for your time, and I hope to connect with you at FACT. Thanks.